in Atlanta, and I'm glad that you had a chance to walk through the exhibition. But you've been very busy recently, and you've had a lot of things going on just this last week. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your OffWhite women's wear runway show you just had, and also the celebration around your Baccarat Crystal Clear collection. I know that these things have been fairly recent for you.
Yeah, appreciate it. I just come, literally my suitcases are just behind that wall from Paris. Had a runway show just a couple days ago where, I'm fortunate to debut ideas that I've crafted over the last 20 years on the same sort of platform that, fashion's major recording system exists, which is Paris. Those brands that are showing on the same schedule are, 50, 60 years old and are esteemed because of their history. And for me, it's important that our history, the collective history or the collective nuances of the culture that exists in this room, that they make their way to Paris and they make their way on that recording system of fashion of a contemporary sense. So, I debuted a show that was, that features sculptures of mine next to fashion of mine. It was a show that was sort of, multi-sensory in a way, and that end result is my sort of offering to the discipline of culture, not specifically fashion or art.
Well, fantastic. I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to ask you about actually is goes to your background, and because for my own self, there's a little bit of commonality. I was a design curator who came to the museum field actually originally wanting to pursue architecture and then architectural history. And so I found your own background in architecture very compelling and enjoyed seeing the project that's included in the exhibition. And there's a great illustration in the exhibition catalog, which I encourage everyone to go get a copy at our museum store after our talk. There's a great illustration captioned Architecture versus Architect. And you talk about this in an interview in the book. And there's a part in particular where you mention whatever you study gets you labeled, but that you, quote, create fashion from an architect's perspective. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you meant?
Yeah. First and foremost, by nature, my practice is sort of very cognizant of art history. I think we're obviously of the generation of the internet, so access to the past is what makes our generation in current times much different than everything that's come before it. So early on when I was young, the job of the youth is to sort of question the presiding generation before it. And I think that's always happened throughout culture. But in terms of an artistic sense, I pretty much, early on knew how the different sort of genres of creativity are labeled, and I made a personal decision to sort of ignore those, just sort of by experiment. It's kind of, when you think of it in hindsight, how ludicrous could it be that if you, between the ages of like 19 to 20 something, you decide to study one thing, and for the rest of your life, you're labeled as that one thing that you did for those 3 or 4 years. And, that could be, you studied art, or you legal, or, painting or something. And I think that's obviously, when you sort of dwell on it, that's how the world sort of works. And it's also a metaphor for how humans categorize things, that way they can understand them. Obviously there's topics of diversity, inclusion, sort of open-mindedness, and all these things that are sort of pop culture sort of nuances of today, but it stems much deeper in the brain than that. It's like, how do I recognize this is a water bottle? They all sort of need to look the same. It looks different than pop, and it looks different than wine, but you can put wine in a water bottle. What does that mean? Or, what does that do? And all of a sudden there's intrigue, and so all that to say, in the creative discipline, I decided that architecture was just a way of thinking. It wasn't a practice that I was going to be labeled as the rest of my creative life. That art, fashion, music, it's all, if you study a tier up from those practical matters, it's literally creativity in the childlike sense. It's just a matter of playing with mediums and materials to make an expression. So my practice, as you can see by the exhibit when you walk through it, things start blurring the lines of, commerce and art or fashion or sculpture or painting in a way to put forth a proposition and not just sort of leave it up to this long-winded rationale that I'm giving you. It has to manifest itself into a physicality, and I need to leave the room, and that needs to sort of bestow itself on you, and so that's sort of a window into how I think and how it manifests itself into, objects like a shoe or a sculpture.
Just as a follow-up on that, there's the sense that architects, on one hand, want to reflect the world, and on the other hand, want to change the world. Do you think that's a fair assessment of how that profession approaches, and do you feel that there's truth in that?
Yeah, I think that's why in the sort of stratospheres of human operation, why art is important. If all these creative expressions are sort of linked to the idea of art or expressing oneself or sort of summarizing the collective emotion of humanity at the time and making a sculpture or a work of art, that's why I put the role of an artist sort of above that of like politics or sort of even civic duties. I think that when it comes to creativity, that is the sort of bridge that can connect people and open people's minds. So to me, there's a vitality in these things called creativity.
Fantastic. One of the things is, as you've noted, one of the things that's remarkable, not only about your body of work, but how the exhibition and how it's structured, is seeing the scope of your work. And we have these images on the screen behind us going through the installation of the exhibition. So when you go through gallery by gallery and you see different moments around fashion, painting, sculpture, furnishing, performance, jewelry, etc. And you've worked with so many artists in music and visual artists as well, Jenny Holzer, Murakami, Arthur Jafa. What have really been the catalysts for you exploring just your curiosity and moving across different media and different approaches, and particularly with some of these collaborations that can be seen in the exhibition?
Yeah, the overarching premise is, and one of the most important works of art in the exhibit itself is ironically this slide that we're sitting on, which is your elevator. I didn't even make it, and it's one of the most important works. And we can use this as an analogy of how I think. You as a community have this amazing sort of institution, but also building. It's a very important piece of architecture that your city has, and you use that to sort of catalog art of its time. And my brain, is immediately attracted to this idea of like catching the baton. And so you have this building that has its history, you have a museum that has a rich history on how it even came to be, and I've sort of intervened with it by sort of analyzing it, but catching the baton at a point where my art practice starts and your building begins, which is this premise of tourist and purist, which it's probably the most presiding sort of compass within my work. And it really speaks to like a modern day segregation into, like this is past race, this is past gender. It exists in the art world as a means to sort of say thumbs up or thumbs down. Like, this is good, this is not, this is art, this is not, this is fashion, this is not. And a purist state of mind I categorize as someone who has so much knowledge that they sort of prop the walls of art up. You know, really tall walls, you belong here, you don't. You know, that's why security exists sort of in museums, to sort of make you feel like you can't touch this, or, you know, like this is worth so much, or this is so important. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, it's a canvas with paint on it. But I don't say that that's wrong. But what the tourist and purist means as the compass within my work is, it's not my opinion, it's a social survey of why art is art. What makes a museum versus the gallery that's in the mall. Basically, you know, there's artwork there too, but why is it held in different regard? And so before I started making art, before I started making my practice, I realized that the purist mentality obviously is important. It keeps things in a sacred space for future generations to understand. It's the same way, you know, I studied, you know, have a graduate degree, because you have to have knowledge of art history to sort of know what your stamp can be. You have to know the nuances how we've gotten here. But on the converse, I categorize this term of like the tourist. It says tourist versus the purist. And the tourist is exactly sort of what it means. It's a generation of people that are eager to learn. You know, they're attracted. It's like when you land in Paris, you go to the Eiffel Tower because you want to see it. You know, when I land, I go to my apartment. You know, I don't go because I was like, oh, I don't want to see the sort of the obvious thing of Paris. But, and I use it as an analogy for art. It's like how many visitors come to the museum to see art. They might not know the art history, but it's valid. And what I analyzed before I started making my practice is that the tourist and the purist you can just divide up the world in that sort of mentality. And as it gets personal to my story, is like I didn't feel like art world was for me. You know, I didn't see artists that looked like me. I didn't see anyone that came from my, let alone physical, but like mental, contemporary sense. You know, I listened to rap music. I looked at hip hop as my version of Paris. You know, I didn't know the designers when they started and what they represented. And obviously I made a lifetime investment into analyzing and coming up with the synthesis of tourist and purist. But as it relates to my artwork, it's, you know, my goal is to make the space where tourists and purists sort of cross paths and have to interact with each other. And, you know, just in the 30 minutes that I was spending time with locals here, I heard a great story, which is sort of checks my list of why this exhibit is important, is that I was told that, you know, you can see the little badges that people wear when they come to the museum, and by the museum sort of hosting an exhibit, you can see the community around it sort of change, because whoever's attracted to the exhibit, it sort of shapes the demographic of the people you see walking around the neighborhood. And, you know, obviously, even in an exhibit like this, it's like the knee-jerk reaction is like, is this art? Or where, you know, like, let me see the Picasso level painting or something like that. But obviously, that's not the main, you know, my work isn't sort of as like knee-jerk reaction as that. There's more layers to it, and then the ambition is to do exactly that. Make a place with my work to sort of have the tourist and the purist interact with each other. That sits above diversity. That sits above like a marketing ploy to like, let's be inclusive. Let's do museum programs to invite the community in. Or it could be as blanket as like, let's sell more merch. You know, like the bookstore committee would love more money coming into it. It's like, and obviously that's where I'm sure we'll discuss later, like the idea of streetwear and et cetera. But ultimately the whole goal is to make work that relates to the generation of people in public that are tourists that don't see themselves in institutions. And that same rationale and sentence applies to my work at Louis Vuitton. You know, I'm the same way. Like, I'm the kid that, even to this day, or when I was in my 20s, like when I walk to the door, the security guard goes like this, like, you know, you can't really come in here. They don't realize that I'm their boss. But it also speaks to my mentality. You know, I think I'm very opinionated, but I have a way of sort of expressing my opinion in a sort of bigger picture, larger goal. Like, I'm not offended by the security guard, who, ironically, we're the same ethnicity, but he thinks that I don't belong there. But, you know, that's too low level to get distracted by the larger goal. I think, you know, what's a more impressive image is me at the end of the runway for Louis Vuitton, and that image coming to a young kid in Atlanta who wants to be a fashion designer, that can tell his parents that he wants to go into fashion design instead of any other degree because he can use me as an example. And so that's the art practice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Music has certainly been an integral part of your life and work, whether DJing and being the founder of Being Trill, or creating designs for Donda, working with Beyonce, pioneer on the transparent sound console seen in the exhibition. And of course, Atlanta is very much a music city. Beyond the presence of music in your life and within your shows, are there similarities or particular parallels in the satisfaction you gain in shaping both your playlists and your fashion?
I think more of my what sort of triggers me is that in terms of black art, you know, like black production, the sort of door, if you look at it like as the art world, there's different doors into it. You know, there's sculpture, there's painting, there's music, there's dance, there is you know, fashion, etc., creativity as a whole. And this is like a generational thing in terms of like growing up, especially in America, and sort of being, like I said, of my descent, and sort of saying, I like creativity, I like fashion, I like art. Music is the only, I say maybe music is this door that's easily accessible into the realm of like black production manifesting itself in sort of credited art. And through history, you can see how that wasn't an easy inroad to make. You know, if you look at the history of jazz or rock and roll, you know, those things and those artists paved their way for it to be sort of believable. And, you know, being a kid from Chicago, a city much like Atlanta, with, you know, Common or Kanye West, you know, that creativity engine and working in music, I saw as like a sort of perfect starting place. You know, this is before fashion of today, to sort of think, but it's all analogous, you know, it's all metaphor. And so music, you know, why I was always attracted to DJing, I think it's one of the best sort of metaphors in modern art to our time now, is that you know, a black art form like hip hop is made from sampling. You know, Dilla or Kanye, or the whole practice, you know, as an art genre, the idea is to take an old jazz record or an old soul record, chop it up, and make it into something new. You know, that's a super profound modern art sort of concept. You know, to me, it's on the level of Duchamp and a fountain or a urinal. You know, but it's ours. You know, it's distinctly something that came in the '80s from Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods that turned hip hop into an art form. And then, you know, DJing specifically, the idea of a mixer and two sources of music, you know, that concept of blending two things together is, you know, monumentous. It changes. It's a large concept that manifests in, you know, playing continuous music for literally to no end. And basically what I've done in my practice and what exists in the exhibit is applying those concepts that came from black music production into realms that are far outside music, and making a practice and making works that sort of extend from the concept that first opened my mind.
Let me follow up on that with just referencing the exhibition catalog again and the interview within the catalog. You mentioned you identify yourself as African rather than African American, and I should mention to the audience that your parents came from Ghana to the U.S.
Yeah.
And you talked about how you, quote, needed to, in a way, learn to be subversive and to embed in your work the messages of what an African artist looks like or what a black artist look like, and that this exhibition bookends a story of where you came from and how you got here. You have this amazing success as a designer and artist on the international stage. Has that approach changed, or has it become even more of a driving force for you?
I think it's even more of a driving force. The whole idea is to tell stories and to open doors. That's what motivates me, is that, it's like, why dedicate yourself to and life as an artist or a creative? The goal is to be remembered for that work, but also to open up doors for others, to hopefully change the landscape of art. I will be sternly disappointed if the High Museum doesn't sort of have an exhibit from an artist that pre the show they might not have understood how it can sort of fit into their overall programming, but post this exhibit sort of understand that what they were looking for in terms of art or artist can formally be different. And I don't mean that overnight, I mean that through the hard work that I continue to do, or the hard work that my creative community continues to do. I see that as important. In the exhibit, I have featured a few artists from my tribe, if you will, Tremaine Emery, Callie DeWitt, and Brendan Fowler. But there's many more than that, and I think to the credit of the museum is allowing me to show my work. Shows a generation of artists that their work also fits within the museum context as well, which to me makes it an all-fulfilling effort.
Well, we're always winners in the museum field if we're putting forward great expressions of creativity and helping amplify those voices. So
exactly. And to your question, even the beginning of your question about African American, et cetera, even when I hear those terms, just know I'm so open-minded that as soon as I hear a box coming, a red alarm goes off in my head. I start thinking how antiquated it is, and it's not. And I understand that we're fighting to be like, this is a water bottle, not Coke or milk, but it's and that's natural human tendency. So I'm not delusional either. That's how the world works. But you can, once I explain it or you see the sort of rationale, I sort of use perception and then counter that with a sort of an upward trajectory expression. So if I'm in Chicago, people think I'm an African, or if when I get to the plane or something and the stewardesses thinks that I'm a basketball player because I'm as tall as I am. It's I'm not offended, but I get that maybe that's the closest box that I could be put in. So, I'll make a funny joke that, I'm a fashion designer or something like that. But which is a funny joke. And then they laugh at that, and so I'm kind of like, oh, this is too funny. But you know what I mean? You sort of an upward trajectory analysis where, obviously, I'm essentially still a kid. My parents are from Ghana and West Africa. All I knew, my parents speak African in the house. So I get, and then of course I travel to Paris, and it's like there's different sort of acknowledgement of what race is, and then I travel to London, but it's just making an estimation about understanding how people work, but countering that with something that is positive has been, like, if someone asks me, like, how did I do it? You know, I get that question a lot. Like, you know, I have an idea, I'm trying to get it together, I'm trying to get traction on it. I would attribute how I've been able to go from making a screen printed t-shirt to designing for the biggest luxury house that's ever existed. It's that I've not sort of closed off an opportunity based on humans' sort of need to put things in a box. I've offered a different route to think about it by my practice, by my demeanor, by my ideas, and that makes a huge difference on your ability to move through these different gatekeepers' doors.
So you've been punching a lot of holes in boxes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Following up on that, can you talk a little bit about the section in the exhibition Black Gaze, which is speaking specifically to race and racism, inclusion, exclusion within the exhibition? Did you yourself have a specific idea that you brought forward to Chicago, to the MCA, and say, you know, I have a very clear idea of about how this section could work and what works might be featured?
Yeah, because I don't focus you know, my practice isn't focused on the sort of specific conversation of race, because I equally think it can be sort of anti-progressive as it can be progressive if purely dwelled upon. But when crafting an exhibit that captures the last 20 years of my work, it was, you know, I approached every curator with the same sort of demand, is that I can understand why there's an attraction to show me and my work, but there has to be an acknowledgement of the certain sort of like purist mentality that was a barrier to exist. And, you know, quite frankly, I wanted to make a connection point with what was my biggest hurdle when I started. You know, when I was just, like I said, when I began, when I was 17, I did not see anyone in the art world that looked like me or I related to. And I wanted to, in the exhibit, sort of like almost in an architectural sense, like solo that sentiment so that a young a 17-year-old that looks like me now can go into the exhibit, it's called the Black Gaze, and say, here, within that space, I see work that relates to his race, but also how he's used it as a tool to sort of offer up a sort of creative expression. So whether it's this painting of the cotton logo that I did, or whether it's the, you know, it's like crazy locally relevant sort of works that's in the video room, and a photograph of one of the first like OffWhite editorials. It's Playboy Cardi, first trip to Paris. We had gotten him a passport for him to leave Atlanta and be, you know, obviously he's in my mind, he's like Miles Davis of our time. Incredibly important, but through the practice of OffWhite, a young Atlanta artist who I think is Miles Davis living is in Paris, seeing this whole other side of the world. And that image is captured, that was just me on my path trying to sort of make OffWhite represent my ideals, but there's a community that comes with it. Ian Connor as well is in an exhibit in the museum of, the High Museum of Atlanta. That to a small community is a very big deal. And that sort of shows like this sort of Trojan horse mentality that has existed in my work since before. And I also acknowledge within like the community of Black artists there's a responsibility to sort of raising these issues so that they're prevalent at some level. But for me, it's not the sort of presiding voice, but it is sort of the main foundation. So the Black Gaze is that room where all the works are sort of soloed out. In that room as well is the neon sign is that you're obviously in the wrong place. That, that's a set design from my very, very first Paris fashion show. And, I took the chatter that was existing within the fashion industry. Instead of letting them whisper it, I just put it in neon light so they could read it when they walked in. And, it's like, that to me is my sort of like, it's like a small example of how I'm taking that purist, or like what could have been a stumbling block, and using it to sort of frame an expression. And, one of the things that I use often in my work is language. Whether it's diagonal lines on a street, that's a form of a language that's universal, or literally using text in the QWERTY keyboard to use quotes. It's framing up a language and a communication system that I can express my ideas.
You recently mentioned in an interview the 2009 Tommy Ton Fashion Week photograph that included you now, quote, predicated the idea of democratization of fashion, end quote. Yet, as you've also discussed, there was the need to make even your earliest work fit within the idea or the price of luxury goods. This last year, you collaborated with IKEA on a line of furnishings that are much more accessible by comparison. Is the idea, at least, of fashion like IKEA design becoming more democratic? Why did you decide to take on the design project for IKEA?
One of the largest motivation was, since my background was in architecture, and obviously there's this like turbulence in this buzzword of streetwear and how it applies to fashion, is that I wanted to showcase to the sort of global community of brands and people in general that design is design, and that means that labeling my designs as streetwear, not the same designs as a fashion designer who comes from a different descent, is already that red alarm going off again of like putting things in a box because it's easier to understand. So at that level, I wanted to showcase that design of a young generation's mind doesn't have to just be in the closet. I was noticing on Instagram that everyone's so proud to show like a photo of their outfit, but not proud to show a photo of their living room. It means that there's a distinct separation of proudness, It like legitimately, I believe that if you figure out how to make a beautiful chair or a beautiful coffee table, it can be just as cool as a pair of sneakers or a pair of
Thank you.
fashion, And and these are things, like it's that tourist and purist thing, when I go to a purist home, like the couch might be the coolest thing in their apartment, not just their, Comme des Garçons sneakers or something like that. And, I'm fortunate, that's where I become super, like what would have been seen as like a negative or a stumbling block gives me my competitive advantage. We're all essentially from the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest literally, but, the South of America, which we could all be put in a box. But what makes us different is what makes us unique. I was able to make it from having these nuanced experiences and having that inform my design on a global scale. Because, mind you, the global scale doesn't know what, per se, Atlanta style is. And being a young designer, a young artist, you could look at that as like, oh, I need to go to Paris, I need to go to school at this certain place to sort of get that like special piece of paper or accomplishment. And I would counter that with saying that what makes you hyper local to your understanding and community is what will make you distinct as the scale gets bigger. And so the IKEA project was, I designed a chair that was the chair that my African parents moved to the Chicago suburbs and they thought of as design. I quite distinctly just put that object in the context of my modern work, and it has a personal story, but also it has its own sort of identity, and it's not just pigeonholed to a t-shirt and a hat and a pair of sneakers.
Well, throughout the exhibition, as you had just mentioned, you can certainly see the various nods to figures in the history of art and design, whether Duchamp, as you had mentioned, Caravaggio, others. And you've spoken about the inescapable presence of words and images in contemporary culture and branding. So do you agree with, I think you called this in an article, an interview in The Guardian last year, with being called the Andy Warhol of our times? And do you see the adoption and adaptation of these images in your work as being in the same vein?
Yeah, I think, and that's where it gets to like an understanding. There it goes again, the little red alarm for being put. But it's like, the writer, and just another one came out last week that was like, or just a couple days ago, it said Virgil is the Karl Lagerfeld of millennials, which I could do a whole 2 hours on that. Like,
we know what our next talk is going to be.
Yeah, exactly. But it's fine. That's again, like, that's what OffWhite sort of means, by the way. It's like, it's not black or white. It's OffWhite too, as well. It's a construct for sort of the biggest box that you could put your own ideals in is choosing, right? Like making a decision to go left or right. I know it's like a brain freeze, but you could go left and right. That's why I call the brand OffWhite. That's what the logic's. It's my internal measuring or compass to never decide. And I know it hurts your brain, and it does mine too. But it's like I equally can take the compliment, and then I can equally see the backhandedness of it, and it doesn't deter me from the trajectory, because the whole goal in the beginning was how do I make, it's like I grow up, I love, like imagine a kid who grows up looking at listening Outkast video, Andre 3000 dressing in snowboard boots, and like, full, like he's breaking every convention known to hip hop at the time. So that's like in my brain as like, look at this artistry, or Kanye West or Jay-Z, like those were the artists that I spoke to me, and I was like, I see artistry, like Pharrell with an Enzo. Actually, it's on my T-shirt, but Pharrell with an Enzo, Ferrari wearing like a gold iPhone that looks like Richie Rich or something like that. Like these are like, that's my Warhol in real time, and we're speaking in dialect. So when you go into Andy Warhol's catalog and you see his logic of fame and how it was affecting pop culture, how he was taking images or ready-made objects like a Brillo box and putting it in a new format, or taking an image of Madonna and, in the purest form, that is trading on the secondary market or at auctions as art. But how come, Jay-Z's album isn't sort of revered as the same as, an artwork in a different format? And so you can quite essentially see, Chief Keef in a sort of, in the lineage of David Hammond's sort of reworking of the American flag on my Supreme T-shirt that doesn't exist in a commerce place, but only exists in museums, as me bringing those worlds together. And in short, you're the comment of me and Warhol. I quite frankly look at art history as something to stand on and build. Like, I don't have enough time in my lifetime to spend trying to trick you to invent something. That's a purist sort of nomenclature to sort of keep sort of artists looking like the generations of art before it, but I'm going off in a tangent. I'll stay on course.
It's good tangent. Yeah, I have to throw out another comment that you said recently, getting to an area which you've been influenced by, and you have certainly shaped the idea of globally, and that is streetwear. And the quote, of course, is that from you is, in my mind, you said, streetwear is going to die. How many more T-shirts can we own? How many more hoodies? How many sneakers?
Yeah.
So my question is, what takes its place?
What takes that's for the artist in this room to catch that baton, like it's very much, because I've learned from the past. I've learned, those years that I was like wandering around Chicago saying like, I'm going into these fashion stores, I want to make that stuff too. Or I'm going into these museums, like I want to make something. I'm not just going to observe, like who from my generation is going to participate. And of course, I think, one of the tropes of like behaving like an artist is obviously keeping a distance from the community, like that, propping up the myth that we're not on the same level is like sort of the first trick to making yourself seem esteemed. And like I consciously dispel that myth. That it took me so many years to sort of get through just that nuance to be able to make work. And I think it's a disservice to the future art generations to not have an understanding about how these worlds exist. That tourist and purist thing was at least 10 years of thinking and meeting with people and trying to get my work seen in a different light. So that, is like an overriding sort of premise. But what was the question? I'll answer it.
What takes streetwear's place?
Oh yeah, so I said the streetwear thing is like, at first I didn't want people to get it confused, like I'm content or happy with being, hey, I have OffWhite, it's a brand that's seemingly doing successful. It's like, I'm not that guy. I'm not just like, I'm not content with it seemingly being successful. I want the whole genre of streetwear to live and exist and be considered A, as credible as every other format of design, and B, sort of be a thought leader, not just like a trend of the moment. And quite classically, I was super shocked at how far that comment kind of virally went, is that me as like a leader of streetwear says it's going to die. Frankly, because nothing in terms of like, I consider an art movement. There's not like one art movement that exists for forever. It's like disco. Like during disco, of course, it was jazzy. It felt like the coolest expression of the modern that time period. It dies. It's like about rock and roll. So it shows more that it's sort of, it can be in a place now where what that tells me is that it's like getting high off its own supply of feeling like streetwear should last forever. Like that to me is more, it should always evolve. Like everything should evolve. Before I started practicing the vein of streetwear that I did, streetwear had died 3 times before that, which also told me that most people who are using the term now didn't understand that there was a history before now. There was a movement in New York and the Lower East Side that birthed Supreme. It was brands like A-Life, Nom de Guerre, Prohibit, Anything. Those were in the 2000s. They boomed and then they all went out of business. And then at the same time, there was a boom in Los Angeles, which is now still Fairfax, but there was a number of brands that existed. So there's all together to say that I want streetwear to be considered like an art movement. I want it to be considered not just related to clothing or sneakers. it's a way of making. It's like a production method. It's a logic that relates to contemporary culture. It will die. There's nothing that lasts forever, so it shouldn't be seen as such. And like I said when I started, it's up to a younger generation to kick me off the seat and then be doing this lecture based on ideas that I can't think of, that the next generation will think of.
Well, not kicking you off the stage too soon, hopefully.
I'll be here for a second.
Okay. Subverting expectations. So now that you are looking ahead to what comes next, what expectations do you have for yourself and your work ahead?
The next phase is doing things such as this. Like there's a tremendous amount of like putting my head down and working and not explaining the work that has gotten me to this point. But now it's a little bit, and I always use the analogy that my practice is pretty much like a Trojan horse type. I knew that from the day one, is that, that sort of metaphor of building a practice to sort of like evade the gatekeeper mentality to ultimately show how the practice is a positive effort to diversify the sort of holy pillars that exist within fashion, music, or art, and right now I would say that as culture moves, fashion is very different than when I started, especially even coming from Paris. The idea of Fashion Week itself has transcended. A friend of mine said at the last, it's like any sort of like independent mentality or underground sort of thought is like, it's us versus them. Like I need to sort of, prove that this sort of radical thought is the new direction forward. And a friend of mine on the way to the Louis Vuitton show said, he's like, you realize that you're the establishment now. And I was like, damn. Like that screws up screws up the whole fight or whatever. But and of course that's only the surface level. Like I'm happy when the whole scene evolves and it's a different place. I'm happy when I see, like all of us in this room now, what's the biggest, there's two malls here that are sort of very well known. What are they called? Exactly, Phipps, Lenox. So, and it's so prevalent in Atlanta rap music. How could I forget? Super big contribution to the world at large. But we all of us that are shoppers know when you go. You remember you'd go into like said luxury brand, and they wouldn't have like the logo T-shirt, right, or the one that was in the video, and now that we go to said luxury brand, that's all you see, season after season, and that's a distinct contribution of Atlanta to Paris luxury fashion. So that's just one indication of how what was at the underground. It's not just me that's now the establishment. It's our culture has obviously reinvigorated sort of purist sort of things like in fashion. So when you ask like what's my goal forward, is to continue showcasing how contemporary culture is changing art, and making objects of art, making new works, making new exhibitions that sort of put on the recording system of the art world that us as a young generation existed and we were doing valid work. So that's why I said the comment about streetwear dying. It was merely a prompt to all those brands on your Instagram feed to sort of analyze, am I streetwear? Is it just as simple as putting the logo of my brand on a t-shirt? Like, is that gonna cut it after we've seen that a million times? Or is there a way to add more intellect to that narrative. I have a friend, if you look up the work of Tremaine Emery, his work is featured in my show. He had just done, he could quote unquote be labeled a streetwear artist, but I think that's putting him in that red alarm thing again, a box, where his collection that he just done with Levi's, he made that same cotton wreath that you see in his artwork exist as a print on the pants. And if it was just saying his name on a t-shirt, that to me is just like what they call streetwear. It's like, it should sell, it has a name on it, like that's enough, no more design. And instead, I urge everyone to sort of Google, it's Denim Tears Levi's. And he launched his project with a video where he came to Atlanta, Georgia, and filmed his grandmother, who was to pick cotton as like a main sort of, in her family history, talking about the idea of what that meant to be a black woman, and her relatives and family picking cotton and how that relates. And and that's when I say street will die and it will sort of rebirth itself into more thoughtful practice, like how beautiful and contemporary. You have a brand that simply wants a collaboration with whatever new and cool. And then you have Tremaine as an artist who can design clothing that has literal stories of generations to tell in a garment made of cotton with Levi's. And just simply that video and the way he released his project, and also having worked at the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, where his grandmother still living, his mother had passed away. He's able to, and his dad is also like a Emmy Award winning CBS correspondent in this one product launch of quote unquote streetwear. Oh shit. He has the jacket on. Stand up and just show people so I'm not like making this up. Yeah, so this is the Levi's Denim Tears. And it's a very like specific, I know I'm probably going over some people's heads, but it's a very important thing that, this is another young black artist, not a fashion designer, not sort of fitting into any box, that's telling compelling stories of family history in clothing. And that to me is what I think the future is, if the whole genre of streetwear is prompt to think a little bit deeper and to tell sort of more intellectual stories than just blanketly selling garments with names on them.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to wrap up my questions here, because I know we're running very close on time. We have a couple of questions that we'd like to take from the audience, but I will ask you if you could continue on that theme a little bit further, because I know one of the questions that we received from so many of you out there, some form of, is there something further you would like to say in terms of your hopes for budding designers out there, those successors? And I'm also going to add one other question on that. Do you have a muse?
That's both good premises. I think, and that's the beauty of coming and sitting in a room with you all, is that this is very different than every room in the whole entire earth, right? And it leans a little bit about, I was saying about, being proud of where you're from and the history of where you're from is exactly what the world stage needs exactly now. We have different cities that are always the mode of communication, and being in a city like Atlanta with a rich history, with a certain panache for the way it thinks and does and operates, that's what the world is calling for when it says things like diversity or sort of new ideas and new perspectives. So my sort of message of advice to a young generation or anyone who's sort of asking me is like, how can I sort of further my practice? First and foremost, it's just doing it instead of talking about it. I find 9 times out of 10 that there's this hesitancy to sort of make the ideas 3D and real. And it seems like an oversight, but that is extremely important, you know. And then making sure that it has a reason for existing is the sort of more important aspect. Like, it's simply like if someone comes to me and is like, hey, I want to do design, I want to do what you do. My question in response is always why. You know, even if there's like a lag of having an answer, that means that the focus isn't sort of expressing an idea, it's more just doing what they feel is a measure of success. And just like the narrative of my friend in the jacket and the story is that he's telling a story and it manifests itself in an object. And the story has to be the captivating part. And once you have the story down, it's a lot easier for that object to communicate to people when it's out in the real world. So that was the first part of the question. What was the
The muse.
Oh, the muse
the
is real
person
people. You know, from my, you know, I did a little like meet and greet for 30 minutes, and I got like 30 ideas just from meeting local people. You know, I already told one story about the stickers in the neighborhood, but the other story I told is I took a photo of an awesome woman's jacket. She was wearing OffWhite. She's probably sitting somewhere around here, and on my Instagram I put museum board director's clothes or something like that. But you know, I muse reality. That's the one part of streetwear that I embrace, is that my ideas come from real people. They come from, you know, like me, and like I was shopping at a mall to learn fashion. Like my fashion school was literally going into Marc Jacobs. Like I learned so much by seeing those fabrics and seeing those designs in real, and that gave me the perspective of what I use every day in my studio to create. So I love local stories. I love meeting real people. I get inspired by the most sort of mundane things. So, you know, I probably have too many muses.
There can never be too many, can there?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, here we have a few questions from the audience. This one is from Sam. Other than fashion, music, and interior design, are there any other avenues in which you'd like to make a creative approach?
Right now I'm into ceramics a lot. I like the materiality, you know. I'm extremely domestic as like counter to a lot of things that I make, you know. I don't know, like I think pretty like limitlessly, and that gives me sort of freedom and makes me sort of super sort of inspired. You know, as you can imagine, I wake up every day and just see any opportunity to create. It doesn't matter the medium. Just try to tell stories. You know, that to me is more interesting now, especially since I said streetwear is going to die. I need to figure out a new job.
You're gonna have to come up with something else.
Figure out my new career.
We have a question from Leela. If you could go back, this is a time travel question. If you could go back to your 20-year-old self, what advice would you give, knowing everything you know now?
That's a funny question, because I wouldn't change a thing. I like you know, I don't promote also like skipping any steps. You know, I love the struggle. You know, you have to have a sort of literally like a love affair. You have to like love the pain of not having everything so easy. And I think that's a valuable lesson to a young generation. Like, of course, I'm speaking from the perspective of like the tourist, trying to encourage more kids to sort of break through the gatekeeper's door, like while it's still cracked open. But I'm equally just in that same way I'm not decisive on going left or right, you could go both. It's super important, the purist nature of making sure that the art world or design world is respected, that it's valid, that the inroads are upheld. I think I'm not the type of person to sort of wish things were a different way. Like, I understand why there needs to be Democrats and Republicans. And I don't think that there should just be one of the other. The natural balance that happens between two sort of polar opposites gives us the world that we have today, which is a democracy. And I think, and this is getting above like notions of art or good or bad or cool or not. It's like how do we as humans organize the reality of the world and the fact that we're a community by default? Like, we need to learn to live together. We need to learn to be positive. I think one thing that might have been missed in my sort of rant, my sort of rambling this whole time is I'm a perpetual optimist. Like, no matter what, I think the world will be fine and it'll be a better place with us on it. That is the only way that, that's something you have to decide on, I think, as a personal person and as a community in itself. And every action hopefully follows that guiding light. And so now that you know that about me and my practice, you can understand sort of the works in it. It's like the idea is to open the doors for other artists who may not have seen themselves in museums pre the show, post the show, can literally go to the hardware store, they can go to the fabric store, they can go to their local screen printer, and they can cite via that book that I've published that this is from 2020 on an inroads to go to a museum curator after you've made a bunch of your t-shirts, or after you've made your mixtape, or after you've DJ'd a million parties, or after you've made a dress for Beyonce or somebody, like that quantifies as an artwork, and it's, if there's a story being told that's a valid story, that it quantifies itself with being in the High Museum.
We have a question from Makumbi. With your various collaborations, how do you translate your unique design language to those different brands and stay true to yourself while being consistent?
For me, it's a tough one, but for me, cohesiveness is key. Cohesiveness and abstraction. I find that great art has like a level of abstraction that sort of allows it to sort of be ubiquitous, I would say. So when I work in different mediums, and obviously the challenge of doing the show is that, I could have easily done sort of like a past look at the work I've been making for 20 years, and it'd been spread out in all these different directions, not making any sort of cohesive sense. But it's like I have my history and the stories I'm trying to tell. Then I also have like a very distinct toolkit of ways of thinking, but also signifiers that I exist. That's the quotes, or that's the diagonal lines, or that's using industrial sort of nomenclature to sort of mark things that exist. There's also the impact of Duchamp sort of claiming a regular object as an art piece, And like I said before, those are certain canons that exist within art that not only serve his practice, but serve the sort of foundation to put other practices on top of. So I have my 5 or 6 sort of rationales, and then I can make, I can make a duffel bag for Louis and reference 2 Chainz. But I can also make 2 Chainz album cover, which was the one that just had literally 2 chains on it. Or I can make an IKEA rug that says "keep off." Those, in in all those random sort of operations of output, it's like I'm saying the same type of like knee-jerk joke, if you will, or I'm using the same type of language to communicate those ideas across variants, a varied array of outputs.
Okay, we have time for maybe just two more quick ones, I think, and we'll. This one's from Dakota. What do you feel is your role / responsibility as an African American man in the fashion industry?
I'll answer them fast because I want to do some real Q&As. You know, like put the mic out there and get some real questions. I think my role is I'll answer it super fast, just to be a role model and to show that, you know, A, race doesn't matter, but B, open up doors so that if a young African American applies to Louis Vuitton after me, that they take the time to sort of review that candidate because they know that my practice, you know, worked out to a positive effect.
We have a question from Katana. What is your ultimate goal as a creator?
Just to dispel, I think my ultimate goal is to open doors. You know, I think I've said it a couple times. That's what makes me sleep at night, you know, is that through, you know, there was moments when I thought what I was doing was impossible. Like, there was moments that I was like, you could imagine me sitting around my living room when I was like, I want to design for Louis Vuitton. Like, how am I going to figure this out? Seemed like it was, I want to design for a fashion house. I don't want to be an independent, you know, and I firmly believe that it wouldn't happen. But obviously, and I'm an optimist, and I don't give up at that. So I made the space for that to exist. So that's the mode going forward.
Well, Virgil, I'd really like to thank you for sitting down with us today and having this conversation. It's been really fantastic having you here and visiting the High Museum, visiting Atlanta. Certainly, we all wish you great success going forward. We know that you're going to continue doing great things. I'm going to be looking for those ceramics that you're working on the next stage as well. But do you have any closing comments or thoughts you'd like to offer us?
Closing comments or the questions? I think I'm breaking a rule.
Are we going to break the
rule?
rule?
Either you have to. Do you want a microphone? You can take one of these.
Okay, we're going to break a rule here.
See,
there we go.
In real time, you know, breaking rules.
We're going to be here for the next 6 hours.
You know. What time? What time do I have to go to the airport? I'll stay here till then.
What?
I will. My flight set will stay here. Take a photo for the gram. Okay, here we go. It's lit. There we go. I see you. How many of you are listening to that new Young Nudie album? Or wait, we're going to do that again. I should have recorded it. So, by a show of hands, how many people are waiting for A Whole Lot of Red, Cardi's album? Okay, cool. How many of you downloaded the new Young Nudie album? Okay, cool. Now we can get to it.
All right. My name is Makumbi. I go to SCAD Atlanta, and I just wanted...
Awesome.
Thanks. Yeah. So I just want to make a quick note of this. We had met like 3 years ago in London when you had the initiation.
You got that T-shirt. Is
Yeah.
that the photo? Yeah. My memory is sharp.
Yeah, and so funny that I had spoken to you about coming to Atlanta before you had even planned the High Museum.
Oh,
and funny
crazy.
enough, you had it here and you're here.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. So my question is, what's been your most challenging collaboration or work, and how did you like tackle it? Like, what was your, I guess?
The most challenging again, it's like I don't look at the challenge as long as I know that like there's a way for it to come out. I don't look at the challenges as like a super negative thing. You know, IKEA was like a tough one. You know, it takes, when you see furniture or something that's mass produced at that scale, that's not fashion, it takes, you know, that took 3 years of work, and it took, you know, a year of thinking of what seems like, you know, very minimal ideas that take an incredible amount of time to come to fruition. And also, like, collaboration is, you know, can be as difficult as like Thanksgiving dinner with your family. You know, it's people coming together that have different ideas, and someone talks about politics, and then it's like everything goes up the window. That's what, like, collaboration is a meta. It's in a similar way can be that. Like, a lot of brands can be like, hey, we want to do something. And then I'm like, hey, let's take your logo off the thing. And then that turns into like a stalemate of ideas. But, you know, I like the challenge of trying to do something, you know, because obviously my work is collaboration is super prevalent in the work. And I like the challenge of it. Next question.
We have it over here.
Hello,
Hey.
my name is Luca. I have a quick question. If you had to rename OffWhite, what would you rename it?
That's a good question. Super good. It took me forever to come up with that one. So let me see. If I would rename it, it would be, it's easy. It would be gray.
Thank you.
Yeah. I like that speed design. That's literally how fast, like, that's how I do it all. It has to be conversational. Next. Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm a 20-year-old technologist and designer. I just want to put it out there. I am going to be the next generation of Donda, these people sitting right here.
Fire.
And so
I believe you.
just talking about that, like, real people, how you mentioned that everybody just looking around here is a mood board full of references, images, like so much history and telling stories. For you and all the other people that have made such an impact, moving forward with the next generation, handing that baton over, what are some things, just I'm imagining a mood board, like what are some things you would just rip off and hand to the next generation to put on their mood board?
One thing I had a meeting yesterday about, because I'm working on OffWhite cosmetics. That's my next like wave. Give you early ideas that haven't hit Hypebeast yet. And in that meeting, my team was like, what would be different? You know, my team has like 30 years of experience, and they said, obviously there's a million brands. Like, you're almost an idiot for wanting to do cosmetics now. You know, the Sephora shelves are full. Like, you know, just because you could sell sneakers doesn't mean that you could sell whatever. And they said, what would make starting a cosmetics brand different distinctly by today than the 50, 60 years ahead of it? And then that opened my mind up crazy, because that's my sort of window and advice to you in technology or anything. There's no greater gift than being young and having less, you know, most people think you need experience, you want sort of to grow up, but the biggest gift that you have is distinctly today in all your sort of bright ideas, and sort of not sort of like whittling yourself down into sort of like having experience. And I think my question would be back at you is like, what is the interconnectedness amongst you and your friends that you guys feel on a regular day about the existing world? And how can you formulate that into your project to the point that the presiding generation doesn't even realize how off base it could be? You know, coronavirus, like, or, you know, I'll wrap it up, but just think about it. Since about holiday time into now, I just had the epiphany that the world is sort of now sort of it's recently been moving at the pace that Instagram scrolls, right? That's how fast culture moves. That's like the speed, that's the speedometer. And what we're at is like this waves of doom, right? So it's like around Christmas times, like Australia's burning. Then we get out of that. Then it was, what was the next one? Oh yeah, Iran. Remember that? Then it's impeachment. Then it's Corona, and then it was, and then it's, well, of course, before that it was plastic straws. And I'm not saying like they were bad. I'm just saying like this is how the world is figuring out its new pace. And what I was saying is, as a young generation, those are all, or Brexit, those are all key points for you guys to sort of synthesize and how you want the adults to behave, how you want these brands that you follow, how you want your technology to support the algorithm of Instagram or support this new utopia that you can create for yourselves, and that will be the next Uber, that will be the next Snapchat, that's the next post. I'm just thinking ideas for you to get rich in tech. But like I super urge that sort of like analyze the existing world, say what you want to change about it, make a project that addresses exactly that, and I guarantee it will get the attention of the outside world. Don't make a brand or something for something small-minded. Make it for a big, lofty goal. Next one.
Hi, I'm Livy. I was just gonna ask is like when you were talking about like not skipping out on those steps as like a young inspiring artist, like what steps do you say not to miss? And like as you were talking about
Yeah, I think one thing that I admit, like finding a mentor that's tough on you. That's enhancing the pain.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe in skipping steps, and like if you want to be in museums, you should be finding someone who works here and like begging to be their mentor. The idea is to work hard, do the 10,000 hours, and I think people think working hard is like thinking hard. I mean like actually working hard. Yeah. Like like you can imagine what my output is, how many hours I spend. When I got here, who was it? Erin, is she around? Was like, no, she ran away. But she was like, how can you have a conversation and be on your phone at the same time? And it's like, that's what got me here. Is literally doing two things at the same time. And I get that the whole world shouldn't do that, like work at the pace, but find something that you're diehard and passionate about, not something that you do 9 to 5 and then you're like, oh, I'm tired, I'm gonna go get dinner with my friends. Like that's more important. It's like anyone's name that you can reference, Warhol, Lagerfeld, Marc Jacobs, Steve Jobs. The reason why those one-word names reference a whole body of work is that they tirelessly dedicated their life to that. Duchamp, like these are people that have, you don't have to do that, that's just the path that I'm on.
And we have time for one final question here.
Hey there, I am Crystal, and you have to forgive me. I think that I'm in a room full of people who probably know your history. I am here on behalf of my son, Chris. But you talked a lot about wanting to open doors for people. Can you tell us or me who opened that first door for you? How did you get in? And I'm not talking about after you had worked for Kanye and done that, but what gave you the first opportunity before that step?
That's a good question. That's such a good question. Like, I have to think. It first starts with my parents, right? I think, and I'll start thinking about it as I move from that point. My parents are, imagine being an immigrant from Ghana in West Africa in like the 70s to Chicago and working a factory job. Leaving a third world country is like, that I've visited a number of times. It's like here you have like a sewer system that are pipes that are under the ground, so that you can just sort of live your life without knowing what's happening with the sort of civic infrastructure. And when I was a kid going to Ghana and West Africa, like the sewage pipe is above the ground, then it's open on the top. You know, the roads are dirt. They're not like even paved. And it's not bad or anything, but that was the circumstance. I was very cognizant that just by my dad and my mother ambition to make it to America, I would have been a teenager living in that same scenario, probably as happy as I am now, but with a complete different set of opportunities at hand. And so if I just stopped at that, it just says, you know, being a good parent to kids and fostering a community that, you know, that's the first gate that opens before you even realize that we're all on a path. That's, you know, being great to your community. But as more to your question, probably how I got on the path of like design and, you know, I very much had the same sort of mentality as like, I would work any opportunity I could get. So the trick to your question is that there's not a specific gatekeeper or there's a specific path. It's doing the work when no one's watching, right? It's talking to it's like talking to, it's like a good reputation will like precede itself. Like if there's somewhere you want to work, if there's somebody you want to work with, like helping the assistant to the assistant to the assistant is the expressway to making that opportunity happen. But most people, they're like, I want to just get to the top. I want to work for the person that I know. You know, it's like you might have to work for free. Say you wanted to work at the museum. Say you wanted to become the chief curator at the High Museum. It's literally not trying to find the phone number for the person who is that in the position today and saying, I want to be their assistant. It's saying, I'm going to rent a warehouse and do a show and exhibit that changes the landscape of Atlanta artists to the point where that curator is going to find out that something is happening locally and they want to find out who did it and how they can be a part of it. And then 2 seconds later, they will be coming to you instead of being like, oh, I can't get my ideas. You know, that's sort of how that. It's not a piece of advice that I can give you more than the mentality that I approach my practice that I think is more valuable.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And I'd like to remind everyone that the exhibition is open until 6 p.m. Please go over there and enjoy it. You have one more week of this wonderful exhibition being here in Atlanta. And most of all, I'd like to thank Virgil. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
You should.